There's a piece of Soul Train history that almost never made it into any highlight reel, any anniversary special, or any glossy retrospective. It wasn't a wardrobe malfunction. It wasn't a miscue. It was a moment of raw, unscripted tension between the man who built the show and one of the young dancers who helped make it famous. A moment so uncomfortable that for decades, almost nobody outside the studio knew it had happened at all. To understand why that single afternoon mattered so much, and why the people running Soul Train wanted it buried, you have to understand what Soul Train actually was, what it meant to people who watched it, and what it cost them, the people who built it. Soul Train looked, from the outside, like pure joy. Saturday mornings. Families gathered around television sets to watch dancers in bell-bottoms and platform shoes move down a studio floor, while some of the biggest names in black music performed just a few feet away. It was color, rhythm, and pride, broadcast into living rooms across the country at a time when black audiences rarely saw themselves represented on national television with anything like that kind of glamour. But behind the cameras, the show that promised love, peace, and soul was also a business, run by a man with very particular ideas about control, image, and who got a benefit from the empire he had built. And when those ideas collided with the people who made the show what it was, things did not always stay peaceful. Don Cornelius did not start out as a television producer. He was a Chicago radio announcer and part-time news reporter with a deep, unhurried voice that seemed built for broadcasting. On the side, he hosted live dance parties for teenagers at high schools around the city. In formal gatherings, he began calling the Soul Train as a nod to the way he would travel from neighborhood to neighborhood, event to event, carrying music with him. Those dances were a hit. Cornelius noticed that the energy in the room, the fashion, the dancing, the sense of community, was something television had never really captured, at least not for a black audience. In August of 1970, that idea became a local television program on WCIU in Chicago. It was modest, black and white cameras, a limited budget, and a handful of teenage dancers recruited largely by word of mouth. But it had something no other show on the air had, a genuine, unfiltered showcase of black youth culture, presented without apology and without a white host explaining it to the audience. Cornelius understood correctly that there was an enormous appetite for this kind of programming, and he began looking for a way to take it national. That opportunity came through a partnership with Johnson Products, the company behind the Afro Sheen hair care line, which agreed to sponsor a syndicated version of the show. In 1971, Soul Train relocated its home base to Los Angeles and began airing in a handful of cities. Within a year, it had expanded to dozens of markets. It became, by most accounts, one of the first nationally syndicated television programs created, hosted, and substantially owned by a black entrepreneur, a distinction Cornelius was fiercely proud of and fiercely protective over for the rest of his life. What made Soul Train work, week after week, wasn't just the musical guests. It was the dancers. They were not professionals. They were teenagers and young adults pulled largely from the neighborhoods around the Los Angeles studio, kids who spent their weekends at record stores and house parties, who brought their own outfits, their own hairstyles, and their own improvised choreography to the floor. Producers didn't choreograph the dance line. The dancers created it themselves in real time in front of the cameras, and that authenticity became the show's signature. For a lot of these young performers, being on Soul Train was a life-changing opportunity. It offered a kind of visibility that simply did not exist anywhere else on network or syndicated television. Some of them went on to real fame. Actress Rosie Perez danced on the show as a teenager before her film career took off. Singer Jody Watley was a regular on the dance floor years before she became a recording artist in her own right. For every dancer who became a household name, there were dozens more who simply got to feel, for a few minutes each Saturday, like the most important people on television. But that opportunity came with a price that wasn't always visible from the audience's living room, according to accounts that surfaced decades later, including interviews tied to the stage musical Hippest Trip, the Soul Train musical. Many of the dancers were never formally paid for their appearances. Instead, they were told they were receiving something more valuable: exposure. On some shooting days, compensation reportedly amounted to little more than a box meal, occasionally described as fried chicken, handed out after a full day of dancing under hot studio lights. Dancers who originated moves that would go on to influence pop culture broadly, moves that other performers and even other television shows would later borrow, said they saw no royalties, no residuals, and no formal credit. There was also, by multiple accounts, an undercurrent of competition that Cornelius allowed and sometimes actively encouraged. Dancers vied for the best spots near the stage or on the elevated risers, positions that meant more camera time and potentially more chance of being noticed by a music industry insider watching from home. That competitive pressure could turn the studio floor into something more fraught than the breezy, carefree image broadcast of viewers. It's against that backdrop that the incident at the center of this story took place. Rosie Perez, years after leaving the show and becoming an established actress, described in interviews a day when tension between herself and Cornelius boiled over into something physical. According to her account, Cornelius pressed to perform in a way she wasn't comfortable with, reportedly connected to his interest in having her join a musical group he was assembling outside of the show. When she pushed back, the disagreement escalated. Perez has said that in the heat of the moment, with nothing else within reach, she grabbed the only thing available to her, the boxed chicken dinner she'd been given as payment for the day's work, and threw it at Cornelius, striking him. It's the kind of moment that, if it had happened on camera during a taping in front of a national audience, would have become an instant piece of television folklore. Instead, it happened away from the lens, in the space between performances, in the gap between the show America saw and the show that actually got made. Perez has since described feeling mortified by her own reaction, even as she stood by her account of what led to it. Writers who have researched the show's history, including Nelson George, author of a definitive book on Soul Train's legacy, have suggested that the underlying dispute wasn't really about a chicken dinner at all. It was about control. Perez had been one of Cornelius's favorite dancers for a long stretch of the show's run, and the fallout from that single confrontation reportedly changed their relationship for good. Stories like this one didn't circulate widely while the show was still on the air. Cornelius ran a tight operation, and he was known for insisting that Soul Train present a polished, controlled image at all times. Performers were required to redo segments if their lip-syncing didn't match the track closely enough. Certain dance styles were discouraged if Cornelius felt they were too suggestive for the show's broadcast standards. The same instinct for control that made Soul Train look effortlessly cool on screen also meant that anything messy, anything that threatened the brand, tended to stay off the record. It's easy to understand, in that context, why producers were never eager to have a story like the Perez incident attached to the show while it was still trying to book major recording artists and hold on to advertisers. The Perez story might have remained a strange, half-forgotten footnote if it hadn't turned out to be part of a broader pattern that came to light much later. Over the years, additional accounts emerged describing a working environment that could be far less warm than the on-screen atmosphere suggested. Some dancers described being pitted against each other for camera time. Others alleged that Cornelius, who was married for much of his time running the show, pursued relationships with some of the young women who danced on the program, allegations that were later reported by the Los Angeles Times as part of a broader examination of the show's internal culture. None of this erased what Soul Train meant to the millions of people who watched it every Saturday, and very few of the dancers who spoke publicly about their experiences ever suggested that the show wasn't worth the sacrifice, or that it hadn't changed their lives for the better in real and lasting ways. But the stories complicated the tidy, nostalgic version of Soul Train's history that tends to dominate anniversary specials and clip compilations. They're a reminder that even the shows people remember as pure celebration were, behind the scenes, workplaces with power imbalances, unpaid labor, and unresolved tension, the kind of tension that doesn't always make it into the highlight reel, but that shaped the show just as much as any performance by James Brown or Aretha Franklin ever did. To really understand why moments like the Perez confrontation happened, and why they stayed hidden for so long, you have to understand how tightly Don Cornelius held on to every part of his creation. He wasn't just the host. He was the owner, the executive producer, and in many ways the sole gatekeeper of the show's image. That level of control was almost unheard of for a black media figure in the early 1970s. Cornelius has been compared to Desi Arnaz, another performer of his era, who managed to secure real ownership over a hit television property rather than simply appearing in front of the camera for someone else's company. For Cornelius, Keeping that ownership meant making deliberate, sometimes cautious choices about how fast to grow, which cities to expand into, and how much creative control to hand off to outside partners. That instinct served the show well in its early years. Cornelius fought off at least one direct attempt to undercut Soul Train's dominance, when a competing program called Soul Unlimited was launched in 1973 with backing from Dick Clark's production company. Cornelius, along with civil rights figure Jesse Jackson, publicly accused the new show of trying to push the only black-owned program off the air by imitating its format. The backlash was swift, and the copycat show was canceled within a matter of weeks. It was a clear demonstration of how seriously Cornelius took protecting what he'd built, and how effectively he could mobilize public opinion when he felt threatened. But that same protectiveness extended to the way Cornelius handled internal criticism and complaints. He wanted Soul Train's public face to remain untouchable, and for a long time, it largely did. Complaints about pay, about treatment, about the more uncomfortable dynamics on set simply didn't reach the audience. The show's reputation as a joyful celebration of black culture and the more complicated reality of how it treated the young people who made that celebration possible existed side by side, mostly out of public view, for decades. By the 1980s, the culture that had given birth to Soul Train was itself changing, and the show struggled to keep pace. The soul and R&B artists who defined its first decade were sharing airtime with a new sound entirely. Hip-hop, Cornelius, by his own admission, never fully connected with the genre. He reportedly told the pioneering rapper Curtis Blow directly that hip-hop wasn't something he personally understood, and he later said that groups associated with the more confrontational end of the genre, like Public Enemy, unsettled him. Even so, the show continued booking rap acts because the audience demanded it, a decision that created its own friction with older viewers who felt the show was drifting from its original identity. Rosie Perez, reflecting later on her time as a dancer and choreographer, said Cornelius was also uncomfortable with the more aggressive, angular dance styles coming out of the East Coast hip-hop scene, styles he considered too suggestive for the show's polished image. It put Cornelius in an odd position. The man who had built his career on giving black artists a stage no one else would offer them was now visibly out of step with where black youth culture was actually heading. In 1993, after more than 2 decades in the host chair, he stepped back from that role entirely, staying on as an executive producer while a rotating cast of celebrity hosts, including comedian Mr. O'Clark, actor Shamar Moore, and Dorian Gregory, took over in front of the camera. None of them, according to people close to production, ever fully replaced what Cornelius brought to the role. Writers who covered the show's later years noted that once Cornelius left the host chair, Soul Train seemed to lose some of its identity, cycling through new faces without ever finding one that resonated the way the original had. The 2000s were not kind to Soul Train. By its 35th season in 2006, ratings had fallen well below where they needed to be to justify continued production, and the show quietly stopped filming new episodes, transitioning instead into a clip-based retrospective format under the title The Best of Soul Train. Much of the show's remaining broadcast footprint had shifted to smaller independent and Fox-affiliated stations, many of which had moved it out of its traditional Saturday afternoon slot and into less desirable late-night hours, making it harder for the audience that had once organized entire weekends around the show to find it at all. The business side of things fell apart around the same time. Tribune Entertainment, which had handled distribution for years, shut down in 2007, leaving Soul Train without a reliable syndication partner. Cornelius tried to find a new home for the brand, eventually striking a deal with Trifecta Entertainment and Media. But the momentum was gone. At the same time, Cornelius's historically strict approach to protecting the show's archive, aggressively pursuing copyright claims against fans who uploaded clips to early video sharing platforms, and resisting unauthorized home video releases, meant that a younger generation of viewers, increasingly used to finding everything online, had a much harder time discovering the show at all. The very control that had helped Cornelius build and protect Soul Train in its first decades may have quietly worked against it in its last ones. In 2008, Cornelius sold the rights to Soul Train to Madvision Entertainment, a company with roots in media and publishing that had new ideas about how to keep the brand alive. One of their first moves was to finally open up the archive that Cornelius had guarded so closely for so long, launching an official Soul Train channel on YouTube in 2009, and striking a deal with Time Life to release classic episodes on DVD. Around the same time, Madvision partnered with BET to revive the Soul Train Music Awards, bringing the ceremony back to television on BET's sister network, Centric, while classic episodes found a second life in reruns on Centric and Bounce TV. 2 years later, in 2011, the rights changed hands again, this time to a group led by basketball legend Magic Johnson, alongside the investment firm Intermedia Partners. That group talked ambitiously about expanding the brand even further, floating ideas for a feature film, a stage production, and even a themed cruise. Johnson's cable network, Aspire TV, began airing Soul Train reruns as part of the deal. Cornelius, for his part, stayed loosely connected to the brand during this period, appearing in documentaries and at anniversary events celebrating the show's legacy, even as his day-to-day involvement in its operation faded. Cornelius's personal life in his final years was, by most accounts, considerably harder than his public image suggested. He went through a difficult marriage and an eventually painful divorce, and people close to him have described a man who was struggling privately in ways that weren't always visible to the people around him. In February of 2012, Don Cornelius died by suicide at his home in Los Angeles. He was 75 years old. The news stunned people who had known him for decades. His longtime business partner, Clarence Avant, has said that he had spoken with Cornelius just a week earlier and that nothing seemed obviously wrong. Nelson George, who spent years researching Cornelius's life for his book on the show's history, has said much the same, that despite some signs in hindsight that something was off, almost no one around him anticipated